Welcome to the Madness and Grace podcast, where we explore the connection between mental health and faith. I'm Dr. Matthew Stanford, neuroscientist, author, and mental health advocate.
And I'm Dr. Madeline Stiers, therapist and trauma researcher. We're so glad you're joining us today. Each week, we have authentic conversations about personal stories, we share professional insights, and explore the meaningful ways faith can influence mental well-being.
Whether you're seeking comfort, understanding, or simply a new perspective, we're here to journey with you. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's dive into today's conversation. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Madness and Grace podcast, where we have conversations around mental health and faith. Today our topic is going to be the power of forgiveness in mental health. And so this is a topic that I've run across quite a bit over the years in my work with mental health, particularly in the context of faith communities, because forgiveness is such an important part of our faith, but it's also a very important part of mental health. So, Manny, maybe you could just give us some thoughts on what you've seen in the clinical environment in relationship to forgiveness, just to kind of kick us off.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that when we're working with clients, and really this goes for anybody just at all, is really trying to understand what forgiveness is. I think it's one of those words we kind of throw around, just like boundaries. Like we say these words all the time, but what is forgiveness? And how do we work towards actually developing the skill to be able to forgive ourselves and forgive others. So, I mean, when I think about forgiveness, I think about forgiveness as, I think people think it's like an emotion or like this kind of ability to say, oh, well, what happened didn't matter, and I forgive your actions because I'm just going to move past it like it didn't happen or it doesn't matter. And that's not actually true. Forgiveness isn't an emotion. It's not like a lack of emotion. Forgiveness is an act. It's a decision that you make to let go of anger or resentment when someone has wronged you or done something to harm you or hurt you or upset you. And I think from a Christian perspective, it reflects God's grace and mercy, right? And how we are working
Absolutely.
To be Christ-like. Do you have anything to add about what forgiveness actually is?
Yeah, I think you make a good point there. I think that really when we're talking about forgiveness kind of and if you want to put it in kind of a secular context, it doesn't have that kind of two sides to it. I think when you look at the verses in the Bible related to forgiveness, I mean, something like Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. But virtually every verse where we're commanded to forgive others, Matthew 6:14 and 15, 1 John 1:9, Luke 6:37. I mean, it really always is this kind of like, we forgive others and God forgives us. And really, it's this thought of God has forgiven us and done this incredible thing for us. And out of that gratitude and that release, we're able to forgive others. And so there's this reciprocal type of thing. So from a faith perspective, I mean, that's the context. And I wrote down, well, like biblical forgiveness is releasing someone from the moral debt they owe you because you yourself have been released from the debt you owed God. And so the thought is this idea of releasing the person from the debt that they owe you as a result of what they did to you. And now you can put that into a secular context too. You can just simply say that's forgiveness. Forgiveness would be, I'm going to no longer require or ruminate on the debt that's required for you. And that debt, if you think about it from a debt perspective, I mean, let's say somebody wronged you in whatever way that is, it might be the debt they owe you is an apology, or a debt they owe you is payback for whatever they stole from you or whatever. Or it might be put in the context of they need to take on punishment because of what they did to you, or vengeance. You need to be able to have an opportunity for vengeance. And what you're saying is, I'm not going to require that.
Right.
What you're not saying, and I think this is probably what we're going to talk about most of the time on this, particularly from a clinical perspective, is what you're not saying is that did not hurt me, or that did not damage me in some way. You're also not saying that I'm going to never remember what you did to me. I'm going to forget it. And what you did doesn't matter in any way. All you're doing is you're saying, I'm no longer going to require you. And it doesn't necessarily, and we can talk about this as well, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to say that to the person.
Correct.
You certainly can forgive a person and never engage them. I've also heard things like, well, I'm ready to forgive them when they're ready to say they're sorry. I'll forgive them when they sincerely apologize to me. But again, I don't think that's, if we're talking about it from a faith perspective, I don't think that's what we're being called to. I think we're being called to forgive. I mean, God forgave us when we weren't willing to apologize for what we did, So I think there's a lot there. I think probably most of the examples that I'll give are kind of extreme examples I've run into over the years where someone was, in a sense, almost forced to try to forgive someone because they thought that was the organization or the group that they were associated with thought that was what was supposed to be done from a faith perspective. So you wronged, you forgive. And so,
Right.
And then I think also, how does forgiveness look in the clinical setting? People come in and they've been hurt, shamed, stigmatized, damaged, right or
Yeah.
wrong.
And I mean, that's really the struggle to forgive is what we see. Forgiveness isn't an issue if you know how to actually forgive someone and accept that there may be information that you'll never get. You may never get an apology. You may never get that, quote, closure that people often look for, or some sort of vindication outcome, right? When an individual gets stuck on getting something from that other person, forgiveness is hard to come by because it's then not a conscious decision that you're making internally. It's dependent upon another person's behavior, and we can't control that, right? So helping someone understand that forgiveness is a choice.
Absolutely.
It is a choice that you make over and over again, oftentimes. So you release the burden and bitterness that weighs heavy on your heart and on your shoulders, right? Because when you're angry and upset someone's wronged you, it's heavy. And if you've ever experienced true forgiveness, you really do feel this kind of like weight. And some people say they get that through, there's lots of ways that we'll talk about in a bit, but that bitterness or that anger, if that's still there, then you have to question, have I really forgiven this person, or am I expecting something in return?
Well, you're still expecting the debt.
The debt, exactly.
In some way to be paid. I mean, that's what it is.
I mean, I know some people in my life who are just really good at forgiveness, and they just go, I forgive you, and they'll set boundaries and they manage the relationships, or they decide to not engage in those relationships any longer. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing that you can do that. But a lot of people will say, and they truly have forgiven that person, right? But a lot of people will say, I forgive you. And then they start thinking about it. And in that moment, they really did forgive them. And then later they start ruminating on what it is that person did, or, if it's like infidelity or something along those lines, relational things with someone who's close to you, not necessarily a stranger. And this is where forgiveness gets tricky, is you then have to forgive that person again in that moment and forgive that person again. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying can take continued abuse or mistreatment by someone and just keep forgiving them for every instance that it happens. No, if someone's continuously...
We're talking about particular
like one
instance
or event, like, for example, infidelity, like if it happened once, when you think about it, it's going to bring upset and hurt and pain back up, but you have to then move through that forgiveness again.
Well, forgiveness, I mean, I think a lot of times people think of forgiveness, and as you said, it is a decision and it's an act, and there are certainly thoughts and feelings that go with it, but it's also, it can also be a process. And I think that, a lot of times it's like, okay, I forgive you. That's it, we're done, And so the reality is that you first may be able to say, well, I forgive you. And then you're able to let go maybe some of the anger that you haven't been able to let go, some other feeling associated. So I think a process of forgiveness is certainly appropriate. I don't see anything wrong with that. I mean, we're human, we're struggling. I think another issue I run into quite a bit is this idea that people of faith, they kind of either decide or unconsciously believe that they're supposed to be able to forgive the way God forgives, which is, I'm going to forgive you, and then I'm never going to remember it ever again. And I'm never going to be able to hold it. The Bible tells us that God, he forgives us and he never remembers it. Like he literally never remembers it. And so, which is a great, comfort to us. We know, and that we're told that because that means he's never going to hold it against us ever again. But that's not how we are. We don't have that ability to self-limit ourselves. And so I think that when you forgive someone, and which is a huge step, just to even be able to say it, even to yourself, and then later the feelings come back up or the pain or whatever, to stop and say, okay, well, where am I in this process? And I'm human. I was hurt, and really depends on what was done to you. I mean, again, I don't want to only use extreme examples, but, probably the most extreme example I ever ran into was a church where a young adolescent was abused by a church staff member, sexually abused, and then was basically forced by the parents and the other staff, the leadership of the church, to openly forgive this person for doing what they had done, because that's what God calls us to do, is to forgive. I mean, that's just traumatizing in its own right, and
Yeah.
so the thing is that, I think this can go to extremes, and that's a clear extreme example. But I also think people should understand that one of the reasons I think there's this kind of reciprocal aspect in the scriptures of, you forgive and God forgives you type of thing, is
Yeah.
that there's a reminder there that really forgiveness is kind of outside our fallen nature. We're not forgiving people. And we want justice and fairness, and I want my part, and you hurt me and I'm going to hurt you. And that actually might be fair. It might be fair that if you
Right.
hurt me, that I should be given an opportunity to hurt you. But what we're being called to is to do something that's kind of contrary to our nature. And so only in Christ, as Paul says there in Ephesians, are we actually able to offer that. And I think that's where we have to say, okay, I'm not going to just keep trying to feel this through myself. It's never going to feel good that in quote unquote, I let this guy off the hook, which
Mhm.
I'll hear that a lot. It's going to be like, okay, why am I forgiving this person? How am I forgiving this person? I'm only going to be able to forgive them because I've been forgiven, and I'm going to draw strength from that. Yes, I was wronged, but I've wronged others, and I wronged God, and I'm going to step back and I'm going to say, you know what? I don't require you to pay your debt. That's all I'm saying. Have you run into, say, clinical clients that they've been probably traumatized in some way, and they just simply can't let go, and then that kind of precludes them from being able to move forward in their, and again, I don't want to
Healing.
minimize
Yeah.
their trauma by saying can't
No,
let go,
just get over it. That's
but
not at all what we're saying.
they can't move forward in their own healing.
It hinders you. I mean, the inability to forgive. And forgiving is not forgetting, and it's not, like you said, letting someone off the hook. It doesn't mean you ever have to engage with that person again. But the inability to forgive, or choosing not to. Some people say, I will never forgive that person. They're intentionally. That's a choice that you get to make. You have free will to do that. And I have seen it really eat people up, because the bitterness and the resentment, those are hard emotions to hold on in your heart every day. And it really can weigh on someone. And I think the fallacy that comes up is that forgiving someone who has done something egregious is saying that what they've done is okay and permissible. And that's not the case. But I think where people get stuck is feeling like, if I do forgive them, then I've given them permission.
Right.
Like,
I think you're
I've
right.
said that it's okay. And it's not true. You can forgive someone and still say what you did was absolutely inappropriate.
Right. And it hurt me.
And it hurt me.
I'm
And
hurt
I may
because of that.
and I may choose to never speak to you again because of that. So here are some things to think about. These are some of the things that I walk people through on, like, what forgiveness is. So first, talking about how it's a choice, like understanding what that is, whether that's from a secular or Christian perspective, right? We've talked a little bit about that. Praying about it, praying, like, what is this going to look like? Where do you need some strength? What is this mercy going to look like in your heart if you're a praying person? You have to figure out what it is that you're forgiving, because if oftentimes situations are very messy, so it's not this whole big forgiveness thing, right? Like, walk through and figure out what it is specifically that you're forgiving, either yourself or another person for. remember all the times that you've been forgiven, right? So think about, we're not perfect. We've obviously done things that have hurt other people, whether intentional or not. And all of the times that people that you love and care about have forgiven you and what that looked like and how good that felt to be given that grace. And then maybe say that you forgive someone, whether you're going to continue that relationship or not. Sometimes you don't speak it to them. Sometimes you do. And then set boundaries. So figure out what the boundaries are that need to either be reestablished or set up. Or are you ending that relationship? What does that look like? So having all of that set up can help make forgiveness feel a little less kind of free floating, right? It's like there's a process to it. This is what I'm working on forgiving. And then remembering, like you said, that forgiveness is a process. And part of that process is it's not necessarily, okay, I've walked through these steps that Maddie just outlined, and now I'm done, and the forgiveness is over. When you think about the situation and the emotions start to arise again, forgiveness doesn't mean those emotions go away. It means that you're going to continuously work to release them, and people do that in different ways. So it doesn't destroy you.
Absolutely. And, I think one of the things that people don't realize a lot of times is that we really get into this idea of fairness with forgiveness. And the reality is that forgiveness, while there certainly potentially is a benefit for the person who's forgiven, okay, the forgiver receives the greater benefit, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Physiologically, they certainly do. I mean, research has demonstrated that when clients are able to forgive a past insult, whatever that might be, physical, spiritual, mental, whatever, they show less depression, they have reduced blood pressure, they're literally more physiologically healthy as a result. And so that's just a fact. And we also know just from a emotional perspective, what's the old, I think it's not really clear who said it, but holding a grudge is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I mean, it's just, a lack of forgiveness or a lack of, it's really part of the process of moving beyond a trauma. You're trapped. It's got you. You're tied. As long, again, I'm not trying to shame people that are. I haven't gone through the pain you're going through and what's been done to you. So forgiveness looks different for different people, but it is a chain that can attach you forever to the person who traumatized you or abused you or hurt you or whatever it may be. And you not really realize that that's what it is. What you believe attaches you to them is their lack of remorse, their lack of paying the debt, whatever that might be. He's never punished the way he should have been punished. And so that's why I can't get beyond this. And unfortunately, we have no control over a lot of times whether the person's going to be remorseful or pay back the debt or whatever. But we certainly have the ability to begin to process what's occurred to us. And as part of that, offer some kind of forgiveness. And again, it doesn't sound fair because it sounds like, as you said, you're letting them off the hook, but that's not at all what forgiveness is. What you're doing is you're saying, I'm no longer going to be tied to you by negative emotions related to this situation. Doesn't mean I don't hurt. Doesn't mean I don't get angry, but whether you're ever punished, whether this ever is made fair, I'm not going to allow that to damage my life. That's the part of it. You may have damaged my life in what you did, but I'm not going to allow that to continue to go on and increase because you're never punished or you never say you're sorry. I hope people hear the distinction there because there is a distinction. I'm not saying they weren't hurt. I'm just saying you won't hurt me anymore moving forward because I'm not able to let this go.
Right. So now I'm thinking, we're talking about forgiveness kind of one-sided, right? Like you've done something to me and I'm the expectation of an apology or, this debt being paid, and I'm going to forgive you. And those are obviously situations like that happen and they're extreme cases. But oftentimes, just day-to-day life, you have interpersonal situations with people where someone makes a mistake and you make a mistake also. And the relational rift is small,
They may not even have known they hurt you.
But both parties have done something quote unquote wrong. Like I've done something to hurt you, you've done something to hurt me. We may have not even realized it. And now I'm telling you what you've done has hurt me. And they say, well, what you did hurt me.
Right.
So I think I see this a lot with people as well. And it's the blame game kind of thing and an inability to take accountability for.
Well, I'm not going to say I'm sorry till you say you're sorry.
Right. What came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing.
Tit for tat kind of a thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so being the quote unquote bigger person and owning what you've done, whether you meant to or not, and apologizing is also a relief, oftentimes.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, there's a lot of freedom in being able to acknowledge, like, I did that and it hurt you and I'm sorry. Like, I won't put you in that situation again. I'll do my best.
Apologizing, being remorseful, doing that is also, it's the other side, as you said, of the coin.
The other side.
But you also have to be willing to do that with no expectation of receiving anything. And, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to become a forgiver, someone who forgives others, but also when you wrong someone, you're able to say, I did that and I'm sorry. And so, no, we a lot of times have a very bent idea of fairness, and I don't know if you've seen it, but a lot of times I'll see some of the biggest arguments between people interpersonally are some of the most trivial little goofy things that have happened. And then, one just compiles on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other. And there may be some legitimate, problems that people should have apologized for or should have forgiven. But at this point, they're so mixed into a bunch of other gunk that it's just really hard sometimes. I think that what we talked about there, we've talked about kind of the extreme where someone's really hurt you and you need to forgive them to let yourself move on. And then I think we've talked a little bit now about this idea of this kind of tit for tat kind of, are you willing to be the bigger person and say, yeah, I'm sorry for what happened? And
the day-to-day forgiveness. Yeah. People are not perfect. Like we are
absolutely not
fallen beings that are going to continuously hurt each other unintentionally.
You should expect people to let you down, and you should expect yourself to let other people down
within reason. Don't go about the world with like the most negative viewpoint. No, but
and I think there's go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, if you have healthy relationships in your family, so for example, my family, parents do something, brother does something that may upset me or let me down, we just voice it. And then they go, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Like, that wasn't my intention. And we're able to move past that. But what we were talking about earlier is that when you have relationships with people and you either never address it, or when you do address it, there's with upset, or the other side's never willing to take any sort of accountability. What you're talking about is it builds up.
Absolutely.
And these trivial matters then become these huge issues that can completely destroy relationships, right? So forgiveness, we started off talking about it from a grand perspective in these things, but forgiveness is a habit that needs to be practiced
absolutely
throughout all of your relationship continuously. And that ability to develop it on a smaller level makes it easier to actually implement and practice at a larger, more grand sense.
On more than one occasion, an individual that I was working with had what they described as a very negative emotional experience or interaction where someone wronged them. And they had held on to it for years, and it had eaten away at them in addition to the other issues that they had, because the other issues that they had that were unrelated probably were exacerbating this.
Mm-hmm.
And when they were moved to, sometimes we have people write a letter, or sometimes we have, different things like that. We found out together that the other person had no idea that they had ever hurt them.
No.
Like, honestly had no idea. And then was tremendously remorseful and sorry. But they had held on to that forever, as this person has wronged me, and how dare they never came and apologized. And they had almost no recollection of the event. And so, again, what I'm talking about is sometimes something is very emotionally salient to us because of other things that are going on, but to the person that did it, it may be virtually meaningless. Not to say that they didn't wrong you, but
just didn't even think about it.
If you're waiting for an apology, And then you're building that up in your mind that how dare that person, I can't believe they wronged me, and they just push it in my face. They literally may have no idea that they have wronged you. Now, that could be their problem. They just may be so kind of emotionally blunted, they don't even understand what's going on, or they really
Sure.
might not know what's going on. So communications a lot of times are, it's a real important part of all this. We don't communicate very well. And then on top of that, not that I want to get off on a long discussion of this, but it's very hard to communicate electronically with people and really pick up on emotions.
Oh,
So I
texting.
promise you, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to promise you that you're going to say, oh, I've seen that 10 times. I have had so many people say to me, can you believe this text that she sent
Oh
me
my
and
God.
he sent me? How snotty is that?
Read this email.
Right. And you're like, what? Like, I
Yeah.
have no clue what the emotion is behind that,
I mean, they've
So,
done studies and they think most people think that they can read tone in
right.
text or email, right? They're so certain, like 100% confident that they could interpret the tone, and like
No
80
idea.
to 90% of the time they're so off and wrong on what was intended.
I
And
mean,
it's
that's why emojis were invented, but they themselves don't really
it's not
reflect
the same.
actual
No.
emotions very well. So, yeah, so I
It's
think,
like,
I
right.
think we have to be a little bit more aware of, the day-to-day interactions and kind of hurts that we have. But again, forgiveness is, for both individuals. You're forgiving someone else because it's a benefit to you, and you're forgiving someone else because it's a benefit to them.
And this is why being human is so hard, right? Because we've been talking about forgiveness, and then we start talking about communication and how really kind of the precipice of forgiveness is you have to be able to communicate as well. So it's being human is hard. And, you've got interpersonal relationships to deal with. You've got all your health you've got to deal with. So,
Well, I think, what I'm going to do is I'm going to segue here in a minute to self-forgiveness, because it's
Mm.
another form of forgiveness that we should talk about. But I think we could get off on a whole discussion here related to this on just how kind of naive people are about what their emotions are, and
Oh, yeah.
and even reading other people's emotions. And so we here at the Hope and Healing Center, when we're working with clients, I mean, one of the sessions we have is helping them understand their emotions. Like, they a lot of times don't even know
More
what
than
emotion they're
one
expressing.
session.
Do what?
It's more than one session
Yeah,
usually.
absolutely. So, but it's just they
the
don't
process.
necessarily even know the difference between anxiety and anger and different, and I know that may sound funny to some people, like, of course I know the difference, but do you know the difference in others? Someone says something to you, which is completely innocuous. It's not a negative statement, but you thought their facial expression said a certain thing. And now a year later, I haven't talked to them since then. I couldn't believe they said that to me, and it was
Yeah.
meaningless. And so
And here we are
so-
going down a rabbit hole. But
I know. Okay.
people
let's jump
don't
in.
even. Wait, I'm going to say this, and then we'll jump back into
Yeah.
self-forgiveness. A lot of people struggle to even know the difference between a thought and a feeling.
Oh, heck yeah.
So I ask that to everyone I work with. I go, tell me the difference between a thought and a feeling. And they're like,
Or even
right,
how they're related.
right.
That-
Or what is
that-
a thought? Explain to me what a
so,
thought is.
you
Right.
know,
So
I-
for you listeners, try to say out loud what a thought is. And maybe you'll realize it's a little bit trickier than.
they very often, they completely separate them. And I've had more than one person I've explained to them the idea that, well, you have a thought, then that leads to a feeling. And it can the other way as well. And then they're like, oh, I never thought about that. Well, I mean, of course, that, like, oh, if I'm thinking negatively of something, I have negative feeling, so it's really interesting. Or I may be having a negative emotional experience, and then that causes me to start having a whole set of negative thoughts associated with that. And a lot of times, I think an easy way for people to kind of get that is that when someone has a panic attack, which is the fear system in their brain just runs out of control, they'll oftentimes have great thoughts of doom and gloom and death and dying, even though they know they're not. And they can
Right.
explain to you they're not. But what I always say is that, when you're having certain feelings, particularly physiological experiences, your brain's going to try to figure something out. So it's the same thing with this. So let's talk about self-forgiveness a little bit with,
Well, in the
I know
context
that,
is. Go ahead.
What?
Sorry. Keep
I
going.
know that we have, particularly with a lot of our clients, a lot of people that we work with, they may have done things or believe they've done things or had thoughts or acted in certain ways which they're not very proud of. And they may never receive forgiveness from the person that they wronged or felt they wronged. But they also can't forgive themselves. They can't let themselves off the hook to move forward. And so talk a little bit about what that kind of looks like in a mental health context.
I think shame and guilt are two feelings or emotions, which are the same thing, to be aware of when we're talking about self-forgiveness. So guilt is appropriate if you have done something to someone, right? You've done something intentional or unintentional to hurt someone. Feeling guilty about that makes sense. That's what apologizing and asking for forgiveness and then forgiving yourself, that's where that comes in to play. Shame. And people think of shame and guilt as interchangeable, and they're not. Guilt is I've done something wrong. Shame is I am wrong. There's something innately wrong with me, right? And so when we see people struggling to forgive themselves for something that they've done or something that they haven't done, but that may place blame on themselves, there's usually a major shame component that is hindering them from moving through forgiveness with themselves or with someone else. But with themselves, it's usually, well, I am wrong. So there's nothing to forgive because I am just bad. So I don't deserve forgiveness from myself or from anybody else. And that impacts their relationships, their mental health, their physical health. Like we see this like totally just combust and it just becomes this big, big problem. Shame can be really, really detrimental to a person's well-being overall. It can impact their spiritual health because again, if you have this deep-rooted belief that you are bad, like innately evil or damaged, how do you say then, but how does your relationship with God look, right? It's oftentimes not rooted in kind of this forgiveness of sins and that we're talking about and this good, healthy connection that we're all striving towards with God. But it really can hinder that. And you see that then reflected in their earthly relationships as well.
You know, and you see in that context, you certainly can get to the idea of someone not receiving forgiveness. Like, for instance, they see themselves as worthless and of no value. And how could God possibly love me in the sense of like, well, I know you say God's forgiven me, but how could he really forgive me? And then that just bleeds over into their own relationships. Like, oh yeah, you know, I really am very sorry that I did that to my sister and I apologize. But even though she said she forgave me, I know she hasn't forgiven me.
What a terrible person.
Right. And then I'm just a horrible person and I don't deserve forgiveness anyway. And again, that you're right, that just bleeds into everything. And so you tend to find the person who's they're either unwilling to forgive themselves, they're unwilling to accept forgiveness from others because they do see themselves as just horrible and unworthy of forgiveness. And certainly, you know, from a theological perspective, we could certainly say that, yes, we are unworthy of forgiveness from God, but he chose to forgive us. There is a component of it where we are involved in the sense that we have to believe we're forgiven. We have to agree with him that we're forgiven. He's still forgiven us, whether we believe it or not. I mean, it's just that we won't know the benefit of that forgiveness. And I think, again, that gets back to where we just started this whole conversation, this idea of within a faith community and within our faith, the idea of being forgiven by God and forgiving others, they kind of go hand in hand. And so out of forgiveness, we're able to forgive. And I think that there is a truth in the fact that we're so broken that we can't forgive others until we receive forgiveness. And so I think there's real honesty in that. But I think this is a tremendously important, I mean, even within the mental health world, there have been forgiveness-oriented therapeutic approaches developed, particularly for people who have suffered trauma and things like that, where forgiveness is a major component of the therapeutic intervention, where specifically they can forgive themselves. People that have been traumatized are tremendously shamed. I mean, they feel responsible for what's occurred to them, or responsible for what happened to others around them.
They're usually told that they're responsible.
Absolutely.
For it.
And then they have to forgive themselves. Some people might just say, let themselves off the hook. They have to be willing to let others be concerned about the moral debt that has to be paid. So to get back to that, as we're getting close to the end here, this idea of, you know, let's say you've been assaulted, whatever that might be, and you are trying to work through your trauma. You know, it wouldn't be a bad thing for you to work to a point where you could say, I'm not responsible for making sure that the person who wronged me is punished in some way for what they did to me. I'm going to let the system deal with that. If they're able to deal with that, great. If they're not, I'm still going to be able to live my life and move forward. That might be a part of your process. It's not to say they don't deserve to be punished. It doesn't say that there isn't a debt to be paid. It's just that you're not going to ruminate all day, every day, and not allow yourself to heal until that occurs. It's also not to say that that isn't a healing thing for you. If, for instance, let's say you said, I forgive my attacker, and then they catch your attacker and they put him on trial and they put him in prison. It's not a wrong thing for you to go, I'm glad they're in prison. They hurt me. You know, I think a lot of times we try to, I may have said this earlier, we try to say, well, we've got to forgive like God forgives, but we're not God. It's not going to happen like that. So I think we forgive in a process. I think we have to be forgivers at as many instances as we can be on our daily interactions so that we are more apt to forgive. It certainly makes it easier. And I think the other thing on the other side of the coin, I would say is, if you never can forgive anybody else, I don't know that you're going to be able to expect a lot of forgiveness from them. So I think that's something to think about. So why don't you give us some final thoughts on forgiveness and mental health?
And I think that was a great summary that you just said. I don't know if I could add much more to it. I really liked what you said a while ago. Out of forgiveness, we can forgive. I think that's a good line to kind of end on. So for all of you out there listening to us, hopefully you got something from today, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
See you again.
Thanks for joining our conversation on this episode of the Madness and Grace podcast. If you found value in our discussion today, we'd love it if you'd subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.
And if you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving us a rating and review. It helps others find these important conversations.
Sharing this podcast with friends and family members is also a wonderful way to extend hope to those who might be struggling with mental health concerns.
We'll be back next time with another candid conversation about madness and grace. See you then.